We're here at the Blessey Hall on the campus of Tulane University, and this is where the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences is located. And normally the work that goes on in our department involves a lot of the broad aspects of earth sciences, from looking at volcanoes and faults all the way to looking at marsh sediment and river processes delivering sediment to the ocean. We have a few geochemists that are in the department. We have a volcanologist. We have a sedimentologist who actually builds deltas downstairs, small-scale deltas, just like the Mississippi River Delta, which we're now sitting on. And we have a structural geologist who looks at faulting. And we also have a paleontologist who looks at fossils of invertebrates. And then my work is mainly geochemistry and applying geochemistry to questions of paleoceanography or paleoclimatology. So I run a stable isotope laboratory, which is located in this building's old carriage house. And we have a mass spectrometer, an isotope ratio mass spectrometer, as well as a vacuum line that we use to prepare the gas samples in which we analyze.
Okay, and so what?
Well, the tool that I use is mainly stable isotope geochemistry, and it's a tool that's applied in a lot of different fields, not only paleoclimatology or paleoceanography, but in my field we use it. We apply this to different records, different archives, and what the stable isotope composition of these archives tells us is information such as temperature of seawater, the type of carbon cycle that was sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere, whether it was photosynthesis or if it was further down the food chain. And it can tell us about where the ultimate source of carbon was, whether it was from the ocean or from the atmosphere. So we measure isotopes, which are simply elements with a few extra neutrons into them. They're stable isotopes for the most part. We do work with carbon-14, which is not stable, but stable isotopes don't decay over time. So the information that's recorded in stable isotopes is stable with time, and it's reflective of different processes such as temperature, evaporation, trophic level, and therefore those tools can be used in a lot of different applications. And we measure primarily oxygen isotopes, stable stable hydrogen isotopes, and stable nitrogen isotopes in my lab, as well as stable carbon isotopes. And we do radiocarbon preparations, but we don't measure them here at Tulane. Radiocarbon samples are normally sent off to one of the national laboratories. Okay, so related to the oil spill, I've teamed up with a group of stable isotope geochemists, and we have sort of two facets. And one facet is to look at the oil and fingerprint it isotopically. And we're going to be measuring hydrogen isotopes and carbon isotopes in the bulk oil, and also in the individual compounds that make up that oil. Oil is a fairly complex mixture of different chemicals. And those chemicals, some of them are more stable through time and others are not so stable. And even in the time span from where the oil comes up to the surface of the ocean from the Deepwater Horizon spill to the point where it lands on a beach or in a marsh, it's changed quite a bit chemically. And those changes will continue along different trajectories depending on what where the oil lands, if it lands on a beach or in a marsh, or if it stays in the marine environment. With isotopes, you can actually take different chemicals and trace some of the isotopic signatures and tell whether some of the chemicals that you see in the environment may have come from oil or other natural processes. The other facet is employing radiocarbon or carbon-14 to oil spill and its derivatives. And this is a very powerful technique because petroleum products in general, are devoid of radiocarbon, of carbon-14, because carbon-14 is unstable, it degrades over time. And most oil deposits are very much older than several half-lives of radiocarbon. Therefore, if it's present at all, it would be at levels far, far below what we can actually measure. So if we take a sample from the marsh or from a beach that is ambiguous, meaning it looks like it may have oil, but it also could just be some natural organic material layers, like a peat layer. We can take that and measure it for its radiocarbon levels, and with some knowledge of the radiocarbon levels of the environment around the oil or before the oil spill, we can determine whether or not there's a likelihood of oil being present in those sediments. One place that we've focused on collecting our samples is at the tip of Grand Isle State Park. And Grand Isle, Louisiana, is the only inhabited or permanently inhabited barrier island in Louisiana. So that provides us some fairly easy access to a sampling site. It also provides us with different environments. We have the sandy beach environment that's on the ocean side, where waves are regularly overturning the sand and there's not as much vegetative growth. Around the back of the island, we also have the Back Bay Lagoon marsh setting. And here, it's a completely different chemical setting for the oil. So if it makes it through the tidal inlet into the bay and lands on the backside of the island, it may undergo a completely different trajectory of chemical change. So by sampling Grand Isle, that provides us with relatively easy access on such a vast coastline, and it has allowed us to do a time series of sampling. So we started sampling there in June, and we've continued sampling roughly every month since then, and we've witnessed quite a bit of change in where the oil is deposited, where we have to dig or go to find the oil, and we've tried to reoccupy the same exact sites through that time series, and we'll continue to do so. In addition to that, we have a marsh site that we've visited that is further up inside of the bay. So this area gets more of a fresh water input from the Mississippi River and its distributaries. Therefore, there's another chemical environment that we're trying to study, and that's how does this oil interact with the sediments and with the marsh in more of a freshwater setting than the saltwater setting that's present at Grand Isle. We anticipate the sampling to go on through this year. The essence of our project is fingerprinting this oil on a time series, and we want to isotopically fingerprint this oil as it changes over time in these different environments. What we've done so far is we've sampled the oil, but doing these measurements is actually fairly time-consuming and tedious, and we've just started to do those measurements now. We don't have many results in terms of the isotopic fingerprints on the oil. We hope to start seeing those results by the end of this year, by around November and December. And we'll continue getting those results while we still sample those same sites through the beginning part, winter and spring of 2011. So our rapid funding from the National Science Foundation allows us to basically fingerprint the oil as it lands and as it degrades in the early stages. Right now, if you go to Grand Isle Beach, for instance, and oil is just washing up, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a geochemist to tell you that that's oil on the beach. But as this oil gets worked into the natural environment, into the surroundings, it will take on a different appearance, a different consistency, and it will get mixed with sand, shells, feathers, reed grasses, all types of materials like that. So it'll be very much more difficult to tell where it happens. Now, if this oil does not just get metabolized to CO2 very quickly, which it probably won't, the changes that could come from very concentrated doses of oil are going to manifest themselves over several years. So this rapid funding from the National Science Foundation enables us to do the initial fingerprinting, but we intend to continue this research and tie it into local geomorphological changes. If there's, for instance, one of the questions we anticipate analyzing in the future would be if there's a section of marsh die-off, we would like to be able to go in and look for that oil signature, some of the isotopic signature that it leaves behind, to try to correlate it with geomorphological changes such as a reef die-off, or if there's some backstepping of the beach due to destabilization of the beach due to vegetative loss. So this will be an ongoing process where the National Science Foundation's rapid money is very important, is for that initial fingerprint, because that will enable us to keep going back to these sites as well as different sites and being able to find whether or not oil is present there at high enough levels to become a possible cause for change. What we're trying to do with the information that we gather, especially from Grand Isle State Park, is continue a collaboration that was set up by one of my colleagues who used to be at Tulane University, Sadruddin Musavi. And he started this collaboration with Grand Isle State Park through an entity that we call service learning. And basically that involves our majors learning about geomorphology of a barrier beach, a barrier island, and in doing so exchanging that information with the state park. As a result of that relationship that was set up through service learning, I intend to continue to share the data that we analyze through our oil work and basically our isotopic tracking of this petroleum, and try to keep them informed as to changes on the island that they see. It's a very dynamic environment. It's always changing. We want to be able to tell them that they can tell visitors to the park that there's a chance that this might be due to the oil, or no, that's a natural change that may have happened because of the cold front that passed last week, for instance. So we intend to keep those lines open, and as it's beneficial to us too, because the Park Service can help us with access issues, and also as cleanup progresses. I don't know how much longer cleanup will be going on, but it helps us get through some of the cleanup red tape and get access to our sites by working with the state park. So it's a nice mutually beneficial relationship. Well, the best example of how the research that I'm doing in relation to this oil spill, how that correlates to research that I've done previously, is research that I've done on Antarctic sediments. Completely different environments, different parts of the world, but we've used radiocarbon techniques to date Antarctic sediments. And these sediments tell a very important story about the growth and the collapse of ice sheets that are attached to the continent of Antarctica. And these have a relationship to how fast ice is moving off of the continent and into the oceans, or vice versa. That becomes very important to try to put a time on these stories that are told in the sediment. It's easy to see boundaries in the sediment where we can say that this was covered by ice, or this is where the ice sheet was collapsing back in geologic time. We need to put dates on those in order to come up with an assessment of whether the changes we see on the Antarctic continent are relevant to our global warming debate. So we've used some novel new radiocarbon techniques to try to improve the chronology of these sediments. And here at Tulane, I've been trying to develop that same technique, not so much for chronology, but to look at the flux of carbon down the Mississippi River and other major river systems. It turns out that river systems are a very effective means by which we can take carbon in the form of CO2 out of the atmosphere via plants and soils growing in the drainage basins, and we can transport that into the ocean and bury it into the ocean. Therefore, we remove it from a very rapid biologic cycle into a slower sediment to rock cycle in the oceans. What we've been doing is using this novel technique and measuring the radiocarbon ages of sediment that's traveling down river systems, and looking at the distribution of ages, how much of the carbon is very old versus how much of it is very young, to sort of reassess our values for carbon sink capabilities of these rivers. And that helps us with our predictions of how much CO2 there will be in the atmosphere in the future based on our status quo of emissions now versus whether we curb our emissions of CO2. So this oil project that was funded by the National Science Foundation uses radiocarbon. It uses the same exact technique, but basically what it's trying to do is separate the oil chemically from the sediments by using radiocarbon signature. So it's the exact same technique. We just have a little bit different types of interpretations to employ with the oil work. Any sediment is going to have some carbon associated with it. Carbon is what we're made out of. It's what plants are made out of. It's the base of all living material on Earth. And as we die and as other things on Earth die, the carbon gets decomposed. Some of it goes back into the atmosphere as CO2. Some types of molecules get stuck onto sediments. So there's always some fraction of carbon in sediments, and this has an isotopic signature. You and I are pretty much alive in terms of radiocarbon. We have a full radiocarbon signature that's similar to the atmosphere right now because we're eating cows and chickens and carrots and lettuce that has equilibrated with the atmosphere. Once we die, though, we're not going to be incorporating any more of this carbon, and that's going to set a clock in our carbon-bearing molecules. And that clock is going to just tick backwards until there's no more radiocarbon left. And that time period is about 50 to 60,000 years by the time there's no measurable radiocarbon or carbon-14 in a source of organic material. So in a sediment that comes from coastal Louisiana or coastal Mississippi, there's going to be carbon that's sourced from the reed grass and the wetlands, and that's going to be very new in terms of radiocarbon, or very alive, just like us. It's going to be actively taking CO2 from the atmosphere and incorporating that into itself with the same signature as the atmosphere. There's also going to be some older marsh grass. There could be some dead animals and some dead plankton, microscopic organisms that are incorporated into it, and that's going to be a little bit older. And then there can also be some fairly old carbon that comes from soils in the Great Plains, in Montana, and West Virginia, because that's all brought down to us by the Mississippi River. So there can be a small fraction of pretty old carbon. And this makes a mixture in the sediment, which is very hard to separate. In radiocarbon ages, different components of that mixture may have very different ages. However, they may be chemically similar, which means that we cannot separate them. Let me just say that again, I guess. These sediments are going to have a mixture of carbon, and some of this is going to be chemically similar, even though it has different radiocarbon ages. And that means we can't separate it out. So the radiocarbon age we measure is going to just be an average of all the different sources, from coal fields in West Virginia to limestones in Montana to reed grasses that are freshly growing in Mississippi or Louisiana. Now, if you add to this mixture oil is several million years old. And that's true, again, in the Deepwater Horizon spill. The oil that came from that was very old. So it's what we call devoid of radiocarbon or carbon-14. It's radiocarbon dead is the more colloquial terminology that we use. Therefore, if this mixes into a sediment in any appreciable amount, that sediment is going to have much less radiocarbon compared to the normal background sediment in the coastal environment here. And what the technique that we're employing does is it takes a sediment and it gradually burns off the organic material. It turns it to CO2, and we catch that CO2 and we measure its radiocarbon content. Now, in a typical sediment, it turns out that reed grass and the fresh carbon is going to burn off at very low temperatures. And things like the West Virginia coal fields and oil from Oklahoma and maybe something derived from limestone in Montana is going to burn off much more slowly and at higher temperatures. So this provides a way where we can separate old from new carbon. And we're undergoing tests right now of the oil to see at what temperatures that burns off, because that we know that that's going to be very old carbon. Now the question is, at what temperature, at what carbon is it going to burn off with in the natural environment? And that's what our technique employs. I think the implications of this oil spill in terms of climate change have to do with probably our behavior. Most of us in this region, most of us in this world are dependent upon oil, whether we'd like to be or not, whether we care or not. And especially when you talk about fishermen on the Gulf Coast, for instance, they use a lot of oil in their boats and in their tools. They use the structures of the oil industry to these sort of artificial reefs that they fish off of. But obviously, having this amount of oil in the water is bad for business. So there's a balance that we have to strike here. So I think that the implications of this spill for climate change would be whether or not it changes our behavior. Seeing the perils of transporting and mining for this oil may cause some of us to ratchet down our personal carbon footprint a little bit. And in that case, it'll have a small effect, maybe an immeasurable effect on climate change. But in terms of the natural world, this influx of oil into the oceans and into our environments may not have as big a change as if our behaviors change. The only other way I can think of this oil having an effect on our global carbon cycle or on climate change is if marsh die-off occurs, and as a result of marsh die-off, we would reduce the amount of carbon sequestration that happens in the large and expansive Louisiana and Mississippi wetlands that are here as a result of the Mississippi River. That could be an issue, and it remains to be seen. We're already rapidly losing these wetlands because of sediment starvation and natural subsidence, as well as carving it up by canals for transportation of goods. So whether or not this oil accelerates that process, that remains to be determined. And hopefully our technique and our isotopic fingerprints from the National Science Foundation RAPID grant will enable us and other scientists to try to answer those questions in the future. So most of our research is focusing on oil on the land. And what we're focusing on is if this oil gets deposited in an area where we're in a sediment zone where there's not oxygen, it's going to have a lot more propensity to stick around for a much longer time. If it gets deposited on a beachfront, on the other hand, where it's constantly getting stirred around by the waves, that's going to get eaten up by natural processes, natural photo and biochemical degradation, much more quickly than that which is buried in the marsh. That's the hypothesis, at least. It will have an effect in drawing down the oxygen levels a little bit in these environments, but the fact of the matter is in a marsh ecosystem, there's a lot of carbon that's a lot easier to eat than oil is. These environments go anoxic fairly quickly as you go down into the sediment column because there's a lot of organic material, a lot of carbon that little microorganisms are munching on, and they're using oxygen in the process. Now, if we move to the marine realm, we're not actively doing research in the marine realm, but it's pretty easy to extrapolate there that if you have oil, organic compounds in the ocean, if those get degraded by biologic entities, by microorganisms, that's going to also use oxygen. There's no two ways around it that process uses oxygen. And what's interesting is that at the depths where some of this oil is being found presently in the marine environment, there's not a lot of oxygen to be had. And furthermore, this oxygen doesn't simply get re-equilibrated with the atmosphere very easily because it's far below the base of mixing in the ocean that's even created during a huge storm such as Katrina. We're still hundreds of meters or even thousands of feet below where this water can be in contact with the atmosphere. Therefore, if we gradually use up the oxygen at those water depths, it's going to be a long time before we see oxygen come back to those depths. We could be talking years to hundreds of years in the Gulf of Mexico. So if this plays out that there is a demand on oxygen due to the oil spill, there is going to be some significant changes in the chemistry of the Gulf of Mexico as we know it. Already there are reports of lower levels of oxygen than normal, but not any levels of oxygen that are alarming for biological activity. The question is, though, that this is still a recent event. I'm a geologist. I like to think of things on a longer time scale. As this oil hangs around at these depths longer, even if it's transported a little bit by currents, it's still going to have more time to use up that oxygen. And this is something that we're going to have to monitor over a longer period of time and be aware of for its potential. Yeah, this spill, scientifically, and I'm probably speaking for a lot of scientists, not just myself, but it's opened up a lot of new collaborations. as I said, I'm a paleoclimatologist, a Paleo-Oceanographer, and I use geochemistry as my tool. Different aspects of geochemistry. That also turns out to be a very good tool for tracking oil, especially as it gets incorporated into our environment. So this has opened up collaborative doors for me to work with other scientists, some who've had a lot more experience working with oil, which is necessary because I need to learn a lot from them, and hopefully they'll learn a lot from me. So there have been opportunities that come out of this in terms of being able to ask new scientific questions. And hopefully in the end it will just improve our understanding of oil, of the risks involved, how small or big they may be, and also in general terms of carbon cycling on Earth. These projects may help us understand carbon cycling a little bit better. Well, carbon cycling is a pretty important question for us right now on a societal level. Carbon cycling means we're all made out of carbon. Everything we eat is made out of carbon, and a lot of things we use on an everyday basis, our cellular phones, our computers, a lot of that is made out of carbon. It's a very valuable resource for us. It's also a major part of our environment. And in general, there are two cycles of carbon. There's one that's very rapid, and that means that plants are taking carbon out of the atmosphere all of the time to build their structures. We and other things are eating those plants, and those things are dying and putting that carbon back into the environment, where decomposers can then turn it back into CO2 by eating it themselves. So that's a cycle. We go from CO2 to organic matter, back from organic matter to CO2. There's a slower carbon cycle whereby we can take carbon out of the atmosphere and we can put it into a longer living reservoir than actual biologic products. And those types of reservoirs would be sediments and rocks. If we can bury carbon in the geologic realm, then it stays inactive more along the lines of the geologic time scale rather than the human lifespan time scale. So these two carbon cycles are constantly exchanging carbon between themselves, and a lot of geologic research at this time, especially in terms of paleoceanography and paleoclimatology, are looking at how carbon is cycling. Because basically what we're doing as humans is we're taking carbon from one of the rock cycles, and part of that cycle is the petroleum reservoir on Earth, and we're rapidly burning it. And geologically, this is in a blink of an eye. We're burning this carbon from a rock reservoir and putting it back into the atmosphere. So this represents a pretty big perturbation in Earth's natural climate cycle and its natural carbon cycle. So as a result, a lot of our studies focus on what's going to happen with all this extra carbon that we're exhuming from the Earth and putting into the atmosphere. Are there any natural carbon sinks that are going to accelerate and bury more carbon to counterbalance what we're doing as a human society, as human civilization? Or are we going to have to do it ourselves through geoengineering? The work that we're doing on the degradation of the oil and tracking its isotopic fingerprint during the degradation process is pretty time-consuming work. It's each analysis is fairly expensive, so we just don't have the resources or the time available to not only measure the extent, the geographic extent of oil deposits, and also fingerprint it isotopically. So what we've done is we've tried to pick our sites wisely based on the different environments where we may see changes in the future that are outside the realm of the time frame of this grant, and we can use our results then to link changes in the environment to the oil spill. But we won't have a good idea of how much oil actually came out of that wellhead as a result of our work directly. I think a lot of people in Mississippi and Louisiana and this part of the Gulf Coast are very interested in the natural progression of their coastline and the fact that we're losing a lot of coastal land every day. A lot of people are worried that by introducing oil at high concentrations into these ecosystems, that it will inhibit the natural processes that trap sediment and help counterbalance the loss of these coastal environments. So our research will hopefully help determine whether geomorphologic changes, that's a fancy word for changes in the rate at which we gain or lose coastline, that will hopefully help us determine whether or not changes in these processes can be linked to the oil spill. So I think that the average Louisianian or Mississippian will have a big interest in our research, whether or not these natural processes, which are already costing us a lot of coastline, have been accelerated by the oil spill. Well, one of the questions which you actually brought up that I'm very interested in is how much oil actually came out of that pipe and where is it now? In the marine environment, this is a very obvious question, and it's a very bothersome question because it's very hard to measure this in the oceans. But a lot of our questions about whether or not this is going to create a hypoxic or an anoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico and beyond hinges on how much oil originally came out, how fast is it moving and mixing with the water mass and with other sources of carbon, and how long is it taking for that oil to biodegrade. So the first step in that process is to actually being able to map the oil, and at what concentration is it present where is an important question. In terms of landed oil, again, one of the fascinating things that we've noticed through our sampling is that the sampling is, or where oil is washing up, is very spatially heterogeneous. That's a fancy way of saying it's splotchy. You can be in one marsh and you can find oil up to your ankles, literally, and you can go a few miles away and not find a trace of the oil. So it's interesting how it's been transported from fairly far offshore into these sensitive ecosystems, and how natural currents and wind patterns have cordoned it into certain areas and kept other areas relatively oil clean. So that's an interesting question that we're not addressing with our research, but I'd like to hear that from other colleagues if they've mapped the oil. There's actually a very interesting tool based on cell phone users, people with smartphones, and anywhere that they've gone and seen oil, they're able to report it, and it basically compiles a map of where oil sightings have been. And we've actually used that. I hate to admit, but we haven't actually contributed to it very well, because we've been too busy sampling, and with oil on our hands, we haven't been wanting to touch our smartphones. But this has been a handy tool that everybody's been involved in compiling, and I'd like to see if any of my colleagues are following up on that work and adding to that map. The research that we've been funded to do from the National Science Foundation in relation to this oil spill is it has two facets. The first facet is looking at the oil in terms of how it's changing in the environment. Now, we know that the oil is going to change chemically, meaning it's going to be worked on by little tiny microorganisms that are living in the water and the sediment. Even just exposure to sunlight itself can start to react the oil chemically. A more stable signal or signature of the oil is its isotopic composition. So one of the facets on which we're working is how does that isotopic composition change, and can we differentiate this oil from other oils and other carbon-bearing constituents of the natural environment by its isotopic composition. So isotopes, you can have several isotopes of carbon, for instance, and all that means is that you have different carbon nuclei with a different amount of neutrons in it. It's still carbon. It still behaves chemically the same way, but isotopically it's a little bit different. And we can use that isotopic fingerprint to trace this oil. Right now, if you go to the beach and oil is washing up, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a geochemist like myself to tell you, well, that's oil. But in the future, as this oil gets worked into the marshes and into the beach sediments and mixes with other things, including the sediment, shells, feathers, reed grass, dead reed grass, it's going to be much harder to tell where the oil is, and it's going to chemically change during this time as well. It's not going to have the same chemical composition as the oil originally did, but hopefully it'll still have the same isotopic composition as it did when it came out of the wellhead. Now, the second facet of our research involves using a slightly different isotope that's in the oil, and that isotope is radioactive carbon, or carbon-14. Radiocarbon or carbon-14 is present in all of us. It's present in the atmosphere at very low levels, and we can measure that. It has a half-life of only about 5,000 years, and we can only measure it back to about 60,000 years, so a few half-lives. Oil is much older than that, so it's actually devoid of radiocarbon or carbon-14, and that allows us to measure the bulk organic chemistry of the sediment that may or may not contain oil, as well as some of the individual chemical constituents of that sediment, and we can find out whether or not it's devoid of radiocarbon or carbon-14, and that can tell us a lot about whether or not there's oil or its byproducts in this sediment or this environment.